started. So I wanted to thank everybody for coming and for being here, and to thank Rich staff very much for coming and presenting a program on the model airplanes and the Flying Aces, which is a national model club. But I appreciate you taking the time and bringing the models over, and it's very fun. We're looking forward to hearing more. And next month will be Dr. Dan Tallman is coming to talk about health issues. So if anybody has any topics, I ran into Dr. Dan at a training, and he said, oh, you know, send me topics. So if anybody's got any thoughts about questions or topics that you'd like me to send to Dan, and he would certainly address them next month when he's here. And the month after that, so that's March, this is March, that's April's Dan, and then it's Gary and Doug.
Oh, really? What month is that?
That would be the beginning of May,
oh,
right
May.
Before town meeting.
Oh, good.
And the election. Let's see, you know, so they'll bring us up to date on what might be on the board.
I may be out of town.
Don't do that.
We'll double.
Yeah, here we go, double.
The political advantage.
Yes, exactly. And also Karen Tyler, our Veteran Service Director, will be here again after the breakfast, so if anybody wanted to stop by and see her, she'll be available. But, and now, I do have to say this, I'm going to try to do it without crying, but we lost our very dear friend Al Miller this week. And Al loved the breakfast, and he had been, you know, participated with the breakfast since we started the breakfast program at Trestle Way. So also, you know, I hadn't mentioned this before, but we'd also lost Al Hallowell earlier this winter. And Al, at one point I had the 3 L's here. So, you know, dear friends, and we'll be thinking about them. So thank you. I know it meant a lot to them to be here with you. So, thank you, Rich.
Am I on?
You're on, sir.
Okay,
We'll totally take over.
I just want a show of hands. How many people are pilots here? Anybody a pilot? Oh, excellent. I can lie like crazy.
I pilot higher and deeper.
I could certainly pile them too, and I'm about to. Just to let you know a little bit about my own history, I am a general aviation pilot, which means I fly light aircraft. I'm retired at this point, but I've always been an airplane enthusiast all my life. I remember when I was a kid in Brooklyn, I used to lay out in the backyard, and we used to watch the big prop liners go over to then Idlewild Airport to LaGuardia and land. It was just really fantastic watching those airplanes. And as I was sharing with Scott earlier, just in terms of my aviation history, I got my license about 15 years ago. And it turned out like this. My wife, Nancy, said, you know, you've been good. The kids have been grown up. You've always wanted to get your pilot's license. Why don't you go and get it? You know, like, what? So I asked her again at dinner time. I said, Nancy, you sure you want me to do this? And she said, yeah, go ahead and do it.
Yes, Richard, it's a risky thing to do.
That's right. And then, you know, we're cuddling in bed, and I said, dear, you know, are you really sure about this? She said, yes, this is wonderful. Go ahead and do it. So I said, that's fantastic. About 4 months later, the bills from Hampton Airport are starting to come in about, you know, $300 or $400, you know, here or there, and she's going, you know, this is getting all expensive. And I said, wait a second, I'm not particularly religious, but I seem to recall that Peter denied Christ in the Garden of Gethsemane 3 times. I asked you 3 times, you know, in the same day, and you said yes. So she was stuck with the flying. But I'm going to talk a little bit about the model airplanes and a little bit of history in terms of my own history about doing things. Have any of you guys built stick and tissue model airplanes with the tissue and so on? One or two people have done that. How I got into it was with my good friend Richie at 10 years of age. We had 15 cents a piece between us to buy a model kit. and we were going to buy a plastic model and put it together and then use it as a toy and, of course, wreck it. Well, we couldn't do that because we didn't have enough money to buy a plastic kit, but the guy in the hobby shop said, for 29 cents, we'll sell you a kit of this airplane. It's a German Fokker D7. This is actually the exact plan of the thing that we built. And to give you a little bit of history about this, at the same time, my mother had bought a refrigerator and threw it out in the alley. And so we decided that this would be the perfect place to build this airplane. What you get when you get a kit like this doesn't look anything like an airplane. It looks like this. And we had no idea what to do with it. So luckily Richie's dad knew what to do with it. And what you do is you pin the parts down onto a plan, and you can kind of look at this later, but it looks like this, and then you take these parts off and you cover them up with tissue. Well, of course, we were doing this in late June when it was hot as hell, and here we are inside a refrigerator box in the alley, putting this together and covering it with airplane dope, you know, trapped in this thing. So at any rate, we didn't know what being high was at the time, but apparently a couple 10-year-olds we did. Of course, we wrecked it. But many years later, I found out that, by the way, I built several of these things when I was a teenager and a kid, all with rubber power. I couldn't afford a gas engine for my airplane, so we used rubber bands. But some years later, as an adult, I was talking to my friend, and he said, oh, there's an organization called the Flying Aces. And I said, what's that? And they said, well, there's a national organization and some local clubs that build and fly these model airplanes. And as you came in, you saw Phineas was greeting you around there. That's Phineas Pinkham. And the Flying Aces started back in the 1930s. And it was with this magazine called Flying Aces. And it was a really great magazine. It had bunches of plans in it, but it also had stories in it. They usually had 3 or 4 short stories or novels in it. And these stories were things that I don't think any 12-year-old kid at the time could have resisted. Who could resist the dust bombs of death? You know, and of course, in all these stories, the bad guys had a German accent, or they were a slippery Chinese or Japanese person that was always doing things. And of course, at the end of each story, they got their comeuppance just in the nick of time as the hero. By the way, the heroes in all these stories had a lovable Irish sidekick, so named Barney or something. So between that, but the Flying Aces today is a national organization in which we build and fly these airplanes. We don't concentrate on just World War I airplanes, but I figured that would be something, since the World War I just ended, you know, a year ago. It might be something to do. Even if you're not, if you have some kind of interest in it, and I know Dick Boucher has gone to this. We fly right here in Georgetown in the Pembroke gym once a month in the winter. And so the 24th of this month, we're flying there. You're all invited to come and see how we fly and what kinds of things we do. Guys are very, very laid back, you know, if you have questions and so on. Even if you just want to come and look and are not particularly interested in building, you're certainly invited. And you can see we do have a contest. We fly airplanes of different types. We fly World War I airplanes, World War II airplanes, some modern airplanes. And we have different events for all of those things. I don't think it's relevant to go over the details with that, unless you want to have some questions about it. Nowadays, we also, if you were to join the national organization of Flying Aces, you get this magazine. It's $15 a year. You get 6 of these magazines. They're really newsletters. and they have at least 3 or 4 model airplane plans in it that you can build information about the national groups and so on. I have been, there are about 1,500 members of this group. I was back in 2008, I was the national championship. I won the national championship for flying outdoors. So we also fly at Woodson Farms in Amesbury. I don't know whether you know anything about Woodson Farms, but it's public land that you can walk on, and even if you're not interested in airplanes, it's just a great place to go and walk around. It's one of the few places in New England that has, I think they have 98 acres of rolling open farmland. So it's just, if you just wanted to walk there, it's really a great thing. But it's that kind of, talking a little bit about the Flying Aces. I'm going to kind of detail into World War I right now. Some of the history of World War I is really the dawn of aviation. The first airplanes that flew in World War I could barely lift a man, let alone a man in a machine gun or so on. And so they were used for observation. But they played a bigger part than you might guess earlier in the war, which made them responsible for the trench warfare. In 1914, the Russians mobilized faster than the Germans thought they could. And the Germans had to take troops away from fighting in France to protect their eastern front. What happened at that time, they had an airplane called the Taube, which was basically a horrible little airplane. Could barely lift 2 people, but they got it in the air, and they saw that this airplane saw that the Russian army was divided into 2 different columns. And Hindenburg at the time realized that he could confront one army, destroy it in detail, and then turn around and destroy the other one. And it was largely because of the their observation that he was able to do this. Meanwhile, on the Western Front, the Germans had beaten the snot out of the English and figured that they were out of the war. And so they decided to send up some aerial observation, and the British had retreated into a forested area near the coast. So the French were confronted with just the Germans, because the Germans thought that the French were out of it. The Germans thought the Brits were out of it. But what occurred was they put up an observation airplane. The British put up an observation airplane, and they saw that the Germans were making this big gray turn. They all had this gray uniform, so there's this big gray wave that was turning towards Paris. And the Germans also put up observation airplanes, but they missed seeing the Brits because they were in the woods. So there was, some of you are familiar with something called the Battle of the Marne, and this was where the French taxi cabs came out and brought troops to confront the Germans, and the Germans were caught between the English and the French, and they had to withdraw, and then that began the whole idea of trench warfare. So aviation played a big part, even though they weren't dropping bombs or shooting at each other. So before I move on, I'm going to have can I have some water up here?
Oh, gosh, I was supposed to run that.
Yeah.
You're just coming out there like...
You sound like my wife. I forgot. I'm going to give you guys a little quiz, and we'll answer it at the end of it. This really has to do with World War II. One of the most famous airplanes in World War II was the Spitfire. Okay? The name Spitfire comes actually from a term used during the British Navy way back during Drake's times during the 1600s. Okay? So the question is going to be, where did that name came from? Did it come from a pesky bird that disturbed the sailors up in the rigging when they tried to go through the Drake Passage from around the south end of South America? Is it a term used for dysentery? Is it a name? That would be B. C is it a name for Drake's favorite cannon, hence Spitfire, or is it a name of the women that occasionally would sneak aboard these ships sailing ships at the time and ply their trade? So those are the four things, and you can we'll see which one is the correct answer at the end of the talk. Any questions so far? Good, because I'm going to be giving you an essay at the end of this.
Because I was so bad, I brought two.
Oh, thanks. I want to talk a little bit about these airplanes, and just about as models. The airplanes that I brought here, we do fly, all of these airplanes fly, by the way. And they all fly under rubber power. But in terms of building and flying these airplanes, these are perhaps the most difficult ones to get to fly because they're biplanes and so on. They're very, very tricky to trim and so on. But in terms of just talking about the history, we have 1, 2, 3, 4 fighters here, or scout airplanes is what they call them in World War I. And the reason they were up there was because of airplanes like this. This is a Halberstadt CL-2, and it was a two-place airplane. It had a gun in the front, and it had a little machine gun in the firing forward as well. It was an observation airplane. And the reason for these fighters was to get rid of these. And the reason was that aerial observation was critical in terms of directing the artillery during World War I. In World War I, artillery killed off 80%, was responsible for 80% of the casualties during the war. So you can see how important that was. These guys initially would shoot off flares and rock their wings and so on to give the directions for the artillery. Later on, they actually had radios in them and would stream out these long antennas out the back in which they would send Morse code and so on. The other thing that these guys did was they took a lot of pictures and they would bring them back. So aerial reconnaissance was really, really critical during World War I, more so than bombing. The bombers at the time really could lift maybe 500 pounds for a single engine airplane, 500-pound bomb, and maybe for the multi-engine airplanes, maybe 1,500 pounds, and they were unbelievably inaccurate. So you know, bombing was not that effective during World War I, but the observation was really important. So they had to develop some way of keeping getting rid of these observation airplanes. There was a Frenchman by the name of Roland Garros, and what he did, and this is absolutely wacky, but the problem is shooting a machine gun through the propellers, you're going to hit the propeller. You know, if you fire enough shots, it's going to go through. And just to give you a little math on this, most of the engines at this time on these airplanes would turn about 1,200 RPMs. Okay, so that means that every time a blade would come in front of, if you had a gun there, every time a blade that would come in front there would be 2,400 times per minute, because you've got two blades going there. In the meantime, you've got a machine gun that shoots 600 rounds per minute. And you were going to shoot your prop off. I mean, there's no way of dealing with that. So what Roland Garros did was he put these metal plates on the propeller blades so that some of them would hit the propeller blades, but they ricochet off, and he risked actually shooting himself down, and so on. And as a matter of fact, the contention is he eventually did shoot himself down. He lived to talk about it, but from the rounds hitting the propeller, it wrecked the engine, and he stalled over German territory and was eventually captured. But he managed to shoot down 5 enemy planes before that happened, and that became the term for ace, and which is still used in air parlance now during World War II, and even during Vietnam. If you shot down 5 airplanes, you were considered an ace. Well, when his airplane crashed in the German area, they knew they were losing observation airplanes, didn't quite understand why. So they gave the problem to a Dutchman by the name of Anthony Fokker. Just tell you a little bit story about Anthony Fokker. During World War II, there was a wing commander in England, and after the war, he was giving a talk about his experience during World War II. And this wing commander, I believe his last name was Lee, he was saying things like, "Oh yes, it was the Battle of Britain, and we were surprised those Fokkers came out of the sun and they really did a job on us, shot down a couple of my mates. I knew about these guys, they had the yellow nose on them, they were the Abbeville boys, and I was going to get them. So the next time I came around, the next day I was up there, I saw them, I got up above the sun and shot that Fokker right down." And his aide-de-camp said, "I know you flew in World War I too. The Fokkers were in World War I, not World War II. And he turned around and he said, "I bloody well know what I'm talking about. Those Fokkers were Messerschmitts." So, to get back to the story of World War I, everybody wanted to shoot these airplanes down. The Brits had observation airplanes and so on. And that brings into the story of these 3 airplanes over here. Most people have heard about the Red Baron, right? Baron von Richthofen and so on. In most law or things that we hear about, they talk about having an all-red airplane. That's true, but he flew a lot of airplanes that were not all red. And these are 2 of them. The Germans were generally ahead of the Allies in technology. And this was one of the airplanes that almost turned the tide of the war in 1917. It is an Albatross D3. There were several Albatrosses models going from D1 all the way up to D5. So there were 5 different versions of this airplane. One of the things that it had that the earlier airplanes did not have, it had 2 machine guns. And you may not think that this is so bad, but one of the problems was they had a lot of problems with jamming during World War I. They didn't understand the fact that if they got to altitude, the guns would freeze. Other times the ammunition wasn't quite precise enough, and it would work in a bolt-action gun like a Mauser or an Enfield, because you could kind of muscle around in and out with the bolt, but you couldn't do that with a machine gun. It had to be precise, and so they were freezing all the time. The other thing, remember I told you about the propeller, 600 rounds per minute. Well, if you got that down to seconds, it's 10 rounds per second. But if you've got a propeller and you use an interrupter gear, it gets down to about 6 or 7 rounds per second. So you're losing about 1/3 of your ammunition. Why is that important? During World War I, if you were flying against your opponent, whether you were an Ally or a German, you had 3 seconds to keep an airplane in your sight. So that wound up, if we do it, it would be 21 shots that you would be able to get off in 3 seconds. If you had 2 machine guns, it doubled that. So that was one thing. And also, if one gun jammed, there's likelihood that the other one was going to do the job. this 3-second thing is rather interesting because World War II, the amount of time that a pilot had to keep the bad guys in your sight, 3 seconds. How much time does Tom Brady have to throw a pass? 3 seconds. You know, it's just kind of an odd thing which keeps circling around. So the more bullets you could put on sight at one time, the better chances we would have of shooting these things down. And the problems in having, I tested this out. I was flying a Piper Cub, so I just tested this out one day. Didn't have a gun with me. All I had was my finger. But I said, I wonder how this works, because these guns, in order to secure them properly, are secured to the frame, which is secured to the engine, which means that they're vibrating like crazy. And so I tried the Piper Cub one day and said, okay, you know, I was flying along out along the coast near Salisbury. There's a couple of towers there. So I said, okay, I'm going to line up and I'm going to try and shoot one of these towers down with my finger, just my finger. And so I laid it on the dashboard of the Cub, and I kept the Cub at about 1,000 RPMs. And lo and behold, my whole finger's going like this the whole time. And that's what was happening here. So these guys had to get on top of each other to shoot the other guy down. And this was one of the planes that did it. The Germans shot down something like over 300 Allied airplanes in 1 month with this airplane. It was just carnage for the Allies. They came along with this airplane and with a number of other airplanes. This is the SE-5A, and it was a real pilot's airplane. It was very, very stable and easy to fly. And it had 2 guns. It had one that shot over the top of the wing, and it had one that shot through the propeller. The kind of interesting thing about this, there were a number of earlier models of airplanes that had this, what they call the Lewis gun, and it was on the top of the wing. Now, nowadays, you know, this is absolutely crazy. It had a drum up here which had the ammunition, about 50 rounds of ammunition in the drum. The pilot, to reload this ammunition drum, had to take the joystick which controls the airplane, hold it between his legs. He's in an airplane that's doing at least 80 miles an hour, has to stand up, remove one drum and put the other one in. How crazy is that? Guys fell out of the airplane to their deaths doing this kind of thing. They had the later ones like this one had a little thing you could pull the whole gun down and then reload it, and then you had a pulley to slide it up there. Well, it kind of worked, you know, but it didn't always work, so it didn't always get latched into its thing, so if you shot the gun, it would fly around in the air and so on. These guys had a lot of problems, and by the way, they had no parachutes. So, you know, these were things, but the reason I mentioned this airplane, it was very, very stable, and one of the things that early on they did not pay attention to was there were a few pilots like von Richthofen for the Germans and Billy Bishop for the British and René Falk for the French. They were excellent pilots and they could fly anything. But most of the pilots were not like that. For instance, René Falk was probably the best marksman in World War I. He would use, as he said, he would only use 3 or 4 bullets to shoot down the Boche. And from what we know from the facts, it's probably true. Well, I was reading a book about another guy by the name of Gould Lee, who wrote to his wife during the time that he was in air combat. And he was an ace at the end of the war. He shot down about 7 airplanes and did some other daring deeds. He strafing trenches and so on. But you know, he recorded that you know, he would chase airplanes around and empty, you know, like all 150 rounds per gun at these guys, and they still wouldn't go down. Or if he was lucky enough to shoot somebody down, it took him 100 rounds to do it. That's the average pilot. You see, Rene Falk is over here, this guy's over here. This airplane enabled an average pilot to line up, get those 3 seconds on the bad guy. So it was an excellent, excellent airplane. I brought along this is, and by the way, all these airplanes fly. I mean, if we took them outside, I'd throw them up in the air and they would fly. But this is one of the airplanes that the Red Baron flew. You'll notice that the German airplanes are very, very colorful. And everybody puts that to fact. You have to understand that the guys flying these airplanes, they were between, most of them were between 18 and 22. Von Richthofen, when he was killed, he was 24. So, as in all wars, these were young guys that were doing, that were protecting their countries. This is rather interesting how they came across the triplane. It was a very slow airplane compared to the SE-5 and a lot of the other Allied airplanes. It was very, very slow, but one of the two things that it could do, it could turn on a dime. And I've been to some air shows and had an acquaintance that actually owned one of these things. And literally by just twisting the rudder in terms of banking the airplane like this, the airplane would turn and literally jump up and turn. So it's a very, very maneuverable airplane, very difficult to fly. So, you know, people like von Richthofen, who were, you know, experienced pilots, could fly it. But the other advantage that it had with those 3 wings, you know, speed is not always going level or going down. This thing could climb like crazy. It would just rise up. And there's a story about this airplane. There was a German pilot by the name of Werner Voss, and he was flying one of these things. Of course, 18 years old. Okay. And so he was flying a triplane like this. And so he decided to pick on 6 of these at the same time, with no wingman, nobody helping him. The interesting thing is that this air battle, which is epic and is repeated, if you go to any books about World War I aviation, a story about him will be in there. And he managed to put holes in every one of the attacking airplanes. And the guys that were flying these airplanes were no beginners. The head of the flight was a guy by the name of Colin Shore, and he was an ace, and at least 3 of the other pilots in that group that were trying to get at Voss were aces as well. He could have escaped at any time, but he insisted on fighting it out. He hit every one of the other airplanes, put holes in them, but none of those shots were fatal. But apparently somebody got a shot on him at some point, and he just started to fly level and just flew into oblivion. So he didn't use the abilities of the airplane to escape. But it also points out that the difference between fighter pilots, guys like Foch, who was the Frenchman, and von Richthofen, both of them were hunters. They didn't just simply go out and shoot, shoot and charge indiscriminately and try and shoot the other people down. They really thought about what they were going to do, and they stalked their opponents. And that's why both of them ran up incredible scores. Von Richthofen shot down 80 airplanes, and Rene Falk shot down 75. Those are confirmed. They both probably shot down more airplanes than that, but those were those were the confirmed kills that these guys had. But it shows a difference between those and this British pilot who was Canadian, actually, Billy Bishop. And what was going on with this guy? I mean, every time he would come in from an air combat, his airplane would be in shreds. And over a 1.5-year period, nobody ever got a fatal shot in on him. He was just damn lucky. And they call guys like that fangs out and hair on fire is what other pilots call them. Usually they don't last long. It was there was an American pilot that was very, very similar to that, and he shot down a bunch of balloons, but you know, he didn't last very long. He got to the front. He had a fantastic score, but it only lasted, you know, like 3 months before somebody got in a fatal shot. So, you know, planning things and so on. The reason why von Richthofen was not only a good pilot, actually he was a crummy pilot. He was a really good shot, and he was a good hunter. The Germans were no jerks when it came to these airplanes. Everything's, well, you know, they were teenagers at the time, or a little bit over teenagers, and that's why they like to hop up their rides with, you know, really cool colors and so on. That's true, but it was also used by the Germans for identification, both on the ground and in the air, so that they could tell who was doing what. And a lot of times von Richthofen wouldn't even engage in combat. He would fly high and he would observe the rest of his squadron and see what they were doing, and he could tell who was who because, you know, somebody looked like this, all red, so he knew it was his squadron, or Yasta is what they were called. Or they might look like this, with the mauve wings and stuff, so he could tell who was who. And he was able to coach them. Apparently he was a very, very good teacher as well. At the end of the war, this was the last airplane. It probably would have done very well. This was one of my first attempts when I was an adult at building an airplane. This was the Fokker D8, and it was called the Flying Razor Blade. And if you look at it head on, it's probably very hard to see this airplane because it's just this wing. So it was a good airplane, but it occurred at the end of World War I, and so it really didn't have much of a chance of developing any kind of record. But when it was up there, it could be quite deadly. The interesting thing about World War I in the air was that the Germans were certainly beaten once the U.S. came into the war on the ground. They ran out of manpower and so on, but in the air, the Germans were still intact. They thought they were winning, you know, and they were kind of shocked at the end when they weren't. So, just some thoughts about things. So on to the question. Raise of hands for how many thinks that it's the pesky bird that was called the Spitfire? Remember the question? Mm-hmm. What was the name of how did Spitfire get it? Or what was the term Spitfire used for? How many think it was the pesky bird? No takers? One taker. All right. How many think it was the dysentery?
What?
The dysentery.
Wow.
The poops. Nobody thinks it's that? How many think it was the cannon? Okay, a lot of the cannon. How many think it was the women of ill repute on the boat? 1 or 2, right? Well, I got news for you. It was the dysentery. In the British Navy at the time, you know, the food was not always so good. You know, the hygiene in terms of, you know, cooking on board wasn't too good. So people would get dysentery, and you know, if you were sitting on a can, it was termed as a spitting fire or spitfire. So it's rather interesting. It's one of those rather interesting things. You can look it up in the history of the British Navy, and it's right there.
On your planes, several of them between the wheels, is that sort of like a little mini wing, and is that maneuverable?
No, it was a mini wing to reduce drag, and actually, that was Anthony Falker was a designer who was always ahead of his time. That actually, you wouldn't think it, but in actual airplanes, just a little bar like this, or like on the Albatross over there, caused more drag than the wing that was put there. It really it improved lift, and it improved a lot of other things. It's quite surprising, but that's one of these counterintuitive things that you would never guess would happen.
Do you have wind tunnels to figure that out, or was that just mathematical things that you came up with?
It was both. The Wrights, when they built the first Wright Flyer, before that they built a wind tunnel. And I don't know whether the wind tunnel is in Dayton, Ohio now, or whether the Smithsonian has it, but the wind tunnels were pretty early thing. The other thing the Wrights did in terms of a wind tunnel, when they didn't have a wind tunnel, they put the wings on their bicycles and went as fast as they could to see how it would affect them. So, but yes, the wind tunnels were important. This airplane, the Fokker D7, I wish I have a model of it, but it's in another exhibit down in Weymouth at this point. But this Fokker D7 was probably the best airplane of World War I. And it was the only airplane named in the Versailles Treaty that the Germans had better hand over. But Anthony Fokker was actually a Dutchman. He was no jerk. As soon as the Germans lost the war, he had as many as they could shipped into Holland. And he kept on to them. But there were a couple of good things about this airplane, and I'll get back to the wind tunnel on this in a second. It was one of the few airplanes that had a welded tubing framework in it. You hit one of these other airplanes with a 30 caliber machine gun. They were mostly 30 caliber rifle machine guns in those airplanes. And it would shatter the wood, and the airplane would lose structural integrity, and down you would go. Less so with the metal tubing. You hit the metal tubing, maybe ricochet off or go through it, but it would still be kind of there. But the Reinhold Platz was one of Fokker's designers, and they figured out that instead of having a very thin wing, if you made a very thick wing, the airplane would have more lift and it would climb better. Now this airplane, it wasn't the fastest airplane at the end of World War I. It wasn't the most maneuverable. It didn't climb. It wasn't the best climbing airplane, but it was a real pilot's airplane, easy to fly, and it did, for example, if it met an SE-5, it could probably outturn it. If it met a Camel, it could certainly outclimb it. If it met some of the French airplanes like a SPAD, it was faster. In other flight envelopes, it might not be as good, but if you had a reasonably smart pilot that said, oh, I'm facing a SPAD, so I better get the hell out of here and give it full throttle and dive, it could do that. So it was the best airplane. And one of the things was it had this very, very thick wing, which gave it an incredible rate of climb. And once they put in it, they had two engines. They had a Mercedes engine for it, and later on they had a BMW engine. And let me stop for a second. You know what the BMW insignia looks like on your car, right? It's a blue and white quadrants. Do you know what that quadrant stands for?
Propeller.
Yeah, it's a whirling propeller. It's a thing of a whirling propeller. Once they put the BMW engine in this thing climbed like crazy, and was and part of it was the thick wing. And again, it was at the time it was counterintuitive because all the other airplanes, this airplane, the SE-5, they kept making the wings thinner and thinner to make it faster and to have less drag. But again, they didn't know that much back then, and with some airplanes, they reached a point of no return where it wasn't going to work that well. And in terms of things. So any other questions here?
In the Second World War, the British had the Spitfire.
Yeah.
What did the Americans have?
Oh, the Americans.
What was their best plane?
The Americans had a bunch of airplanes during World War II. My favorite is the P-47. It was a big fighter. All the other airplanes had like 6 machine guns in the wings. The P-47 had 8. And the really good pilots would have their guns so that all 8 rounds would converge about 150 yards out from where the airplane was. So if you got into that and they just punched that gun for 1 second, 8 rounds that are half an inch in diameter, and some of them are explosive and others are all kinds of stuff. I mean, if you see some of the gun footage of that, these guys in the P-47s, they would just touch that gun tip and you'd see the wing blow off the airplane and the whole airplane would disintegrate.
That's what the Black Sheep Squadron.
Yeah, they flew F-4U Corsairs, which had a bent wing. They had the same engine as the P-47. These are big radial engines, and one of the advantages of radial engines was
2800.
Yeah, our 2800. Who said that? Yeah, somebody knows something about this. The R2800. It put out well over 2,000 horsepower. It was a big airplane, and the F-4U Corsair had the same engine. They only had 6 weenie 50 caliber machine guns instead of 8. Later, they had 4 20mm cannons in them, which really did things. The interesting thing, to answer your question, the queen of the sky during World War II was probably the P-51 Mustang. It was like the Fokker D7 in World War I. It did everything well. Maybe wasn't best at everything, but it did everything really, really well. The dumb thing about the Air Force was that after World War II, they got rid of all their P-47s and they kept the P-51. Well, the jet age came along, and the P-51 was designed as a high-altitude fighter. Now Korea comes along, and it's going to be a ground attack airplane. And it had a liquid-cooled piston engine in it. So if you put just 1 round into the cooling system, the thing was done. It would overheat, the engine would seize, and down you would go. If they had kept to the P-47, which is one of my all-time favorite airplanes, had that big engine, you could literally shoot cylinders and pistons off the thing and have, the engine would be a wreck, but it would still be running as long as it had some sort of oil in it. So.
Was that the Thunderbolt?
Yes, that was the Thunderbolt. My favorite airplane, and it worked great in World War II. Once the P-51 came along, they used the P-47 primarily as ground attack right after Normandy. And if you see the gun foot, if you watch the military channel, you see this all the time of these tanks and stuff being shot up. Nearly always there were P-47s that were doing that, because the P-51s were.
Did the Germans have a special plane for the torpedoes, or was that just an addition to the existing plane?
They used a number of their bombers as torpedo attack planes. The Ju-88, which was a twin engine, a high-speed bomber. They used, it was a very flexible, I don't know whether you're familiar with the Mitchell bomber that we had, the plane that bombed Tokyo. The B-25. The B-25 was a very, very flexible platform and was used throughout the Pacific in all kinds of ways for bombing, and the Navy used it for anti-shipping and so on. So it was really good. And the Ju-88 was kind of like the German equivalent of that, and they used it for bombing and stuff like that. Although they put it on a Focke-Wulf 190, which was a single-engine fighter, which was really kind of a tiny airplane to be hauling a giant torpedo around. But, you know, you did what you had to do at the time. So any other questions? See, ding. It goes off. If you have, if you want to take one of these slips and bringing a. Oh, I see.
They need to access the APP.
Okay, we'll just move to this. I'll just finish up with Phineas here. If you remember, I said that there were adventure stories in the original Flying Aces, and most of them are a riot. And Phineas is the American aviator that appears in a lot of these stories. He's always in trouble with the brass. He's always in trouble with Babette, his girlfriend, and he's always in trouble with the Germans. But you read these stories, and they're hilarious in a lot of ways. In the end, you know, Phineas always comes out on top. So it's you know, some of these stories are just a riot. You know, I think in one story he manages to put a goat in Colonel von Hoffendorfer's airplane, and it screws everything up. It gives you an idea of the kinds of things that they do.
I think the engines on the Fokker put out, the crankshaft was bolted to the end, to the aircraft itself, and the cylinders rotated around.
Those were
power attached to the cylinders.
Those were rotary engine.
Rotary engine.
And they were, the reason they were used was they were very light, and because the engine and the propeller rotated together, the spinning of that thing, of the engine, enabled them to be cooled efficiently. But there was a lot of gyroscopic precession.
A lot of torque.
And the torque. And as the engines got more powerful, it became unmanageable. One of the things was that one of the more famous airplanes on the Allied side during World War I was the Sopwith Camel. And to show you how crazy things were in World War I, and today it's still touted as one of the best fighters of its era, and I think that that's baloney, and here's why. Its losses, its combat losses against German airplanes was about, they lost about 500 aircraft to the Germans. They lost something like 450 aircraft in operational training accidents with the airplane. It was very, very difficult to fly. It was very unstable, which made it really great if you were a very, very good pilot like Billy Bishop. But if you were the average pilot, it could very easily kill you. And I have some letters from some of these World War I pilots that talk about how unstable it was, and how, you know, the Brits would be sitting there and they'd hear a crash out there and say, "Oh dear, that's another Camel. I guess Chumley won't be having any drinks tonight," because they got wiped out. So any airplane that you know, almost 50% of the deaths caused in that airplane are operational, for operational reasons, can't be very, very good. You know, I wouldn't get in it. I get into a D7 or the Spitfire, the SC-5 any day. Nice, stable airplanes. People I've talked to that have actually flown them, you know, really like them. But the Camel, if you flew it, you had to fly it with almost half the stick forward. It was very, very taxing to fly. And if you're just trying to stay in the air, you know, that doesn't help. You want to stay alive. And meanwhile, somebody else is comfortable, doesn't have to pay attention to staying in the air, and can take more attention to shooting you down. You know, there's an advantage there.
When did they invent the parachute?
they didn't have them in the beginning of a, and this was a real bone of contention, both for the German pilots and for the Allied pilots. And the argument on both sides, I've done a lot of reading on this. There's a guy, Don Lee, I think his name, he actually wrote a book called No Parachutes, and he talks about his experience throughout the war, that he constantly complained about the fact that there were no parachutes. And they had workable parachutes. The balloon observers had parachutes, and if they saw, you know, an enemy aircraft coming, they'd jump out and parachute to safety. At the very end of the war, some of the German aircraft had parachutes. In the beginning of the war, it was kind of understandable because weight was really a problem. These were underpowered airplanes. If they did 70 miles an hour, it was a big deal. But towards the end of the war, this SE-5 had a Hispano-Suiza engine, had something like 250 horsepower. It had enough power to get off the ground, and a parachute would have been a minimal kind of concern. But there was really resistance among the brass, and the thinking was crazy back then. Well, you know, you looked at it, the Battle of the Somme, the British lost, first day when they opened the battle, they lost something like 20,000 casualties between killed and wounded. I mean, that's appalling, you know. So, okay, so you had a flight, you sent out a flight of SE-5s and 5 of them got shot down and only 1 guy returned. Well, that's only 5 guys you lost. That's the way they thought about it back then. It would be unacceptable today, but that's the way they thought about these things. Anything else? Okay, well, thank you. You've been a very attentive audience. Oh,